Good morning, friends, colleagues, and my seniors in academia. My name is Nancy Mwali, a reviewer and mentor at IDA Africa, and a PhD student in finance at St. Paul's University. I'm sorry I'm unable to join you in the live session, but I'm happy to share this with you in form of a recording to be able to share my experience and the knowledge that I have so far in designing and the development of a conceptual framework. So I pray that you'll be able to learn a thing or two that will be able to support you in just conceptualization of your study and just to be able to make the connections between the various areas of your study using the conceptual framework. So very quickly, we'll start with definition of some of what the conceptual framework would be and some of the elements that it represents before we go into, as we proceed, as we progress with the conversation. So I would define the conceptual framework as a diagrammatic representation of concepts that are the main variables in a study. In this case, you study, and how these are then related to each other. It guides the path of your research and offers the foundation for establishing its credibility. It is the researcher's explanation of how the research problem would be explored and how it would be resolved. I'll then go ahead to say the conceptual framework presents an integral way of looking at the problem under the study because it has many components that are represented in the form of a diagram to be able to help the researcher or the person looking at the study to understand the study better. It is the simplest way through which a researcher presents their asserted remedies to the problem they have defined. What are the remedies? What are the proposed remedies to the problem that you are defining as a researcher? So the conceptual framework would be able to show that. Okay. We can go ahead to say that it's also a representation of the relationships that you expect to see between the variables that are significant to your study, reflecting the thinking of the researcher. As soon as someone looks at your conceptual framework, they'll be able to understand your thinking as the researcher. What are you thinking? Where are you coming from? What is your problem and what is your possible solution? To clearly define the variables of the research topic and their relationships, there is the use of the arrows. And of course, arrows for conceptual frameworks have meanings. Every arrow that you draw, every line that you draw, whichever direction it faces, it has meaning because it is actually going ahead to explain how one variable relates to the other variable. So even as you draw the arrows, just always remember that they do have meanings and they can easily help to explain the relationships or confuse the person that is reading altogether. So we need to be careful about those. They also help to show, I've already said, they help to show the relationship between one variable and the other. Just hold on, I'm having problems. Okay. So as you develop your conceptual framework, one of the first things you need to be able to do is to identify the study variables. And from your topic of study, you should be able to identify the independent variable and the dependent variable. This can can be identified very easily from your topic. The dependent variable is the problem variable, the problem that you're trying to resolve. It is dependent on the independent variable, which would then call the explanatory variable or the solution variable. Once you've identified those two, it is key that you identify those. You identify the independent variable, and you also identify the problem variable. Once you identify those, you then go ahead to identify the constructs that will be used to explain the variables. Ideally, this should be 2 or 3, or you follow the guidelines either in your university or in your area of discipline. Or your study can also guide how many constructs you need to be able to sufficiently and exhaustively explain your problem variable. But then again, you also need to be careful about how many constructs you put, because the more the constructs, the larger your study and the wider your study will be. The independent variables are what will form the objectives of the study. That is where you're going to it's those variables, either 2 or 3. If you have 3 variables constructs, then it means that you're going to have 3 objectives, and so on and so forth. You also need to identify at this point other influencing variables. Those are moderator variables, mediator variables, intervening variables, and so on, depending on what your study is, what your study is about, and how the various variables are related. Then you'll be able to identify other influencing variables in your study. In master's level, it might not be really critical or mandatory, but at PhD level, it is important. It is not wise to assume or let other people, fill in the blanks that there may be other variables that are influencing the relationship between your independent variable and your dependent variable. Always try to identify other variables that could influence the outcome of those two relationships. So it's always good to identify a variable that can influence that relationship or change the direction of the relationship. Okay, we'll continue. After that, you then start making the connections. These should start all the way from the topic to the objectives, as we had indicated, then to the research questions, to the hypothesis, if your study will have that, and then to the theoretical framework, which I believe one of my colleagues will be able to address that. We'll be talking about the theoretical framework, the literature review, all the way through to the research tools. I say this because the variables that you have that have been identified from your topic, the variables that are glaring from your topic, should be the same ones that are you're now using to formulate your objectives. That way, there's a connection between your topic and the objectives of your research. After that, if you're going to have research questions, the variables that you're using on your research questions are the same ones that were on the objectives and the same ones that are in the topic. That goes all the way to the hypothesis, as I had indicated, and then to the theoretical framework. As you're identifying the theories that underpin your study, your theories should be centered around the key variables that you've already identified for your study, as we had discussed in the previous slide. And then in the literature review, as you then delve into the discussions about what the authors are saying about your area of study, you need to also focus and limit yourself around the study variables that you've already identified, both the dependent and independent variables. So that consistency is very key, and you have to go all the way and make the connections all the way to the research tools so that you ask the right questions. The objectives or the research questions that you had, if there were 5, those will be the broad areas in your questionnaire, and you then go ahead to ask specific questions under each research question, or let me say each research objective. You ask specific questions that do not veer off the variables that you had already identified. So stick to those. After that, after making those connections, the researcher, after you have done that, after you've made the connection, you also now have to go ahead to produce a diagrammatic representation of your variables in the study. Ideally, you should put your independent variables on the right, and then you have arrows pointing towards the left, towards the problem variable, showing how these independent variables will then contribute to resolving the problem of the study, which is the dependent variable. These then have to explain the relationships among them and how they complement each other towards helping the researcher in answering the major research problem that has already been identified. So what you're saying here is that if someone looks at your conceptual framework, will they be able to see that this is the problem and these are the solutions that the researcher is presenting to resolve this problem that we have identified? In a snapshot, someone looking at your study should be able to see that from the conceptual framework, and then how all these variables are connected to each other. After that, I will try and summarize what that then means in terms of the steps as we try to conclude. Step 1, choose your research question. That would be the topic or the area of study. Number 2, select your independent and dependent variables. Identify them from the topic. You must have a problem variable and a solution variable. Step 3, you need to review literature. Literature review is very, very important in a lot of when you're developing your study, or when you're conceptualizing your study, you need to have reviewed some literature, because literature is what then validates your area, whether there's a problem and what that problem looks like. The variables that you are identifying, are they variables that have been discussed before, and what are the authors saying about that? So review of literature, I would say, is a continuous process. Usually it starts even before you pen anything down. The minute you start thinking of an idea, the minute you start, even before you write down the research topic, maybe the research area could be taking shape, but the way the topic will be crafted may not necessarily be very clear, because you're still reading your literature and it's a continuous process. So I've just put it, for the purpose of this discussion, I've put it as step 3, but ideally you'd even find it as step 1, because you need to have reviewed and delved into some literature even as you conceptualize your study. Then we go into visualizing your cause and effect relationship. This simply just means which variables affect which variables and how, okay? And then also we talked about the influencing variables. You need to be able to identify those. And then finally, you generate the conceptual framework. In a different presentation, I had talked about, I'd even given an example of how what a conceptual framework would look like. Maybe Aurelia, at some point, you can, maybe in a different session, you can share that topic when we discussed about literature. Sorry, we discussed about conceptual framework, and I gave some examples. Maybe Aurelia will be able to give you share that with you. It was shared in the group, but she can reshare it and just guide you to the session, or rather the minute, where I was presenting the example of the theoretical framework. But then this highly depends on your area of study, depends on your specific study, depends on your university, but the underpinning concepts are the same. Ensure that the constructs as presented in the conceptual framework are linked, the construct and those variables are linked to your topic. Don't have a different variable in your topic and you have a different one in your research objectives. You have a different one in your questions and hypotheses. You're discussing something different in your theoretical review. You have identified theories whose who that don't strengthen some of the variables that you identified further. And then, of course, the literature review and ultimately your research tools. All this must be aligned. Otherwise, the entire study may not necessarily have a logical flow. So in summary, the conceptual framework is a condensed summary, a condensed diagrammatic summary of what your study variables are all about. Ensure that you're very consistent with the variables without introducing new concepts and variables at different stages of the study. Do not interchange the words, even synonyms. If you use one word, just use the same word consistently so that there's a pattern and there's a logical flow all the way from your topic, beginning from your topic all the way to your study tools, which would be the questionnaire. I hope I have supported you to be able to understand what a conceptual framework is. I hope that if there are any questions, Aurelia can take them, and then I will, in a different session, respond to them, or I can respond to them in the group in writing, and then we can continue interacting in the group as far as the conceptual framework is concerned. I'm sure there are other colleagues here who also have something that they can add to this conversation. And let's keep the conversation going. Let's have questions and let's share the answers after this session. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that you're able to just join in, even if I am not here to do the presentation. And I wish you a great morning and a restful weekend. And above all, an enjoyable rest of the session. Thank you so much and have a good day.